Welcome everyone. I'm Elizabeth Bailey. I'm a lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Lincoln. I'm going to talk to you today about the idea of coordinated priorities, how we develop our digital practice, how we innovate, and how we focus on blended learning and the lessons we've taken from this over the last year, how we do this, as well as ensuring our practice is inclusive and we work towards an EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, agenda. This talk was born out of my work with, as I've called it here, my two hats on. My role as chair of our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee and my role as our digital lead in the School of Education here. I'm going to talk to you about our work over the last academic year. And I want us to consider how we can adopt a coordinated approach to our digital education work and our equalities work, both at the planning level, and I'll use the School of Education's trial of a coordinated approach this year to illustrate my thinking here, as well as at the individual level, and I'll provide some illustrative case studies for this part of the presentation. I want this to be the start of a conversation, to set us up for the new academic year. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I'd like us to start thinking about how this could really work in reality. So, as I said, this presentation was born out of the two hats that I normally wear in my job in the School of Education. And wearing these two hats over the last year, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, has, as you'll be familiar with, brought some very specific challenges. I list some of these challenges here, both from my own experience and the literature that's now emerging in this area. So, as we can see, the challenges for students and the resulting challenges for staff to best support these students are wide-ranging. And looking at this list, we may on the one hand see the pandemic and blended learning as having increasing demands on students and therefore staff. And we may see it as having intensified pre-existing issues and strengthening some barriers to learning that students already face, as well as therefore widening those gaps that we know to exist in terms of access to the curriculum, access to resources, and ultimately students' attainment, and more importantly, in my view, the whole package of what they should get out of university. So now I turn to look at what my roles have meant individually over the last year, and first of all, my role as EDI chair. Work relating to equality, diversity and inclusion, to me, means the following things. It means fighting for progress. It means having a responsibility towards my students, towards future students and towards the future citizens that those students will become. As well as a responsibility to myself, it means allyship, it means advocacy, it means championing those voices who are not heard as loudly. It means fighting for change, it means raising awareness, and it means providing education to myself, to my team, and to my students. Within the School of Education, over the last year, we have looked at, and we will be looking at, the following as a team. We run the EDI Committee with a monthly focus. For that month, we educate ourselves, we read, we reflect, we talk to one another. We might look at our use of terminology, we might look at our practice, we create action plans for the following year, for example. In essence, each month we do a different set of activities that relate to our monthly focus. So that's what our EDI Committee looks like. Now I'll turn to talk about my work as a digital lead, responsible for overseeing our school's approach to all things digital education related. Like many of you, I'm sure last year has focused on blended learning and preparing our team for blended learning and preparing our students for blended learning. It's looked at how we engage students in new ways and how student engagement has evolved over the year as we get used to our changing working situation. It's involved helping to prepare my colleagues and myself for those changes, and it's involved collaborating together in new ways and trying to find the most productive way to collaborate together and to ensure we do the best for our students. As part of this has involved acting as a mentor, a sounding board, someone who's there to provide advice where I can, and signpost to better advice where I can't. As we found our feet with blended learning, we look to try new approaches, to try new software, and to see where we can improve our practice. As always, this focused on learning needs, which, as I demonstrated on a previous slide, has become more complex in many regards recently. They've also become harder to assess a lot of the time, and in some instances have changed or intensified. So looking at our work separately, I now want to think about what happens when we combine these approaches, when we combine these priorities and look at them together. Firstly, I want to look at what I've called the planning level. So when we sit down over the summer to decide what our committees are going to do, when we write action plans to reflect on the year before, this is the one key opportunity we have for a coordinated approach. This year, without giving this too much thought, I naturally fell into a more coordinated approach. As I thought about what challenges lay ahead for this year and how I could be the most productive in my role, and the school could be the most productive in their response to the pandemic. So this emerged quite organically without me sitting down to think about whether we needed a coordinated approach and what that might really mean, as I'm doing now. So this is where the subject for this talk really was born, as I began to appreciate the importance of a coordinated approach, and I looked to solidify this as I move forward in these roles. So for starters, I identified two key areas in which we could coordinate our approach. So these are two areas that our school looked at over the last year. So as part of the monthly focus for EDI and as part of my digital action plan, I overlapped these two areas. Firstly, the impact of COVID-19, and specifically on vulnerable and marginalised groups. And secondly, when we looked at neurodiversity, inclusion and accessibility. These two initially stood out to me as areas ripe for this coordinated approach. Firstly, the impact of COVID-19. We took the time to assess this in November, and we planned a blended learning midpoint review partway through the term. We got student feedback and we got staff feedback, and we circulated this. We looked at the challenges students were facing in a practical sense in terms of their learning, and we actioned key findings from this and implemented some changes immediately. But also, we looked at this in terms of the view of whether the pandemic had disadvantaged them in any way. As I said, we shared our findings with staff and we reflected on this and made changes that were needed, ready for the term ahead. We also looked at the literature that was coming out about this time and focused on how we could better empathise with the students and better support them. When looking at neurodiversity, inclusion and accessibility, we wanted to make sure that our knowledge was up to date, and we used the university resources in order to do that. We also wanted to use our newly formed student EDI committee, to ensure that we heard from students and that we understood how they perceived neurodiversity and their own needs within this. They produced a collage for us with quotes that inspired them or that summed up neurodiversity for them and how they felt about it and what they understood it to mean. Now, I want to move on to talk about how this coordinated approach might work at what I'm calling the individual level. I was particularly inspired for this part of the talk by a discussion I had with our student EDI committee, where we were talking about the pandemic and the resulting changes that may have happened in terms of practice. And I made a comment saying that, well, one size doesn't fit all, right? And a student replied to me saying, well, actually, one size doesn't even fit one person all of the time. And I thought this was so spot on. With this in mind, I've created some illustrative case studies, which are a combination of experiences I've had with different students over recent months. I've thought about how blended learning, or digital tools maybe, have helped students who may experience barriers to their learning for a number of complex and intersecting reasons, and how it could continue to. Firstly, I'm showing you the case of a male student with ADHD. From my experience, there is the potential for students like this to be disengaged. As a male student, for example, they are a minority on our course in education. Their ADHD means that they can sometimes feel isolated or misunderstood, and this can manifest itself in missed sessions, amongst other things. The student may also miss sessions as they don't feel they can come onto campus and focus in a room with their peers. Being stuck in a room for an hour or longer often, in our school certainly, can be a real challenge on certain days for some students with ADHD. I should say the same is true for online sessions as well. Sitting at a computer for an hour or longer is not always going to work for students with ADHD. But from what I've seen over the last year, digital education offers some key opportunities for students like this, in the form of, for example, shorter pre-recorded micro-lectures that they can watch anytime, when they're ready. They can absorb in shorter, more manageable chunks. The student's expected to focus for less time. Or by providing them with the option for at-home learning. When the student feels unable to focus within a classroom setting, they can log on to the live session online, just like we've been doing. Online tools also offer opportunities in terms of representation. It allows us to access people that we can't physically access all the time, that we can't invite into our classrooms, that we just don't have the resources to. It allows us to offer online lectures and workshops and seminars, etc., from groups who are not represented within the staff, or simply a wider, more diverse range of people. In this case, I give the example of a male student as something that we are expected to reflect on as a female-heavy course, if you like. In our Athena Swan application, for example, that's something that we reflect on. But I wanted to stress that, in my opinion, we should be considering this in a much wider way. But that is perhaps a subject for another talk. The internet allows us to develop social networks as well. It allows us to develop communities of practice and areas where students who have similar learning needs can be connected with one another. They can share experiences and they can amplify their voices. Ultimately, the flexibility that it brings allows us to work with the fact that one size doesn't fit one person all of the time. Now, I just want to pause here to say that this is by no means intended to be an exhaustive list of the opportunities that online and digital learning, blended learning brings us, or even the challenges that a student like this may face. My intention is really just to illustrate potential at this point and to start conversations. And I welcome your experiences when we come together to discuss this presentation, in terms of the issues that I've highlighted here, and others. I have one more case study that I want to share with you, and that's of a first-year student who has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, who also faces mental health issues including social anxiety and depression. This student may not feel like they can see themselves in the stories that we tell, in the staff members they come across, amongst their peers even. They may struggle to socially integrate. They may struggle to understand the rules, if you like, of the classroom, the rules of social engagement in the classroom. We know that students with mental health issues are more likely to drop out of university, are more likely to struggle in so many ways. And autism spectrum disorder complicates that even further. It's a complex set, like I say, of intersecting needs and requirements and potential challenges. Even with an effort to create thriving social communities on our courses, for some students there is always going to be difficulty engaging socially, and this is always going to have the potential to lead to social exclusion. We can't always, of course, control how our students behave towards their peers, no matter how hard we try. This often manifests itself, in my experience, in issues relating to attendance and engagement, which can lead to attainment issues, as well as limiting the students' opportunity to get everything out of education that they deserve to. But what I found over the course of last year was that actually there were some very specific opportunities for students like this. For example, students were able to privately direct message the lecturer on Collaborate Ultra. I had students using this who weren't comfortable to speak in front of the whole class, even in a message format. And in a normal classroom situation, if I can use that word, in a face-to-face classroom situation, these students would just stay silent. Students with social anxiety and other similar issues often thrive on chat box type answers where they're not required to show their face or to use their microphone. And they can also benefit from recorded sessions where they are not expected to conform to social classroom behaviours that they are not as comfortable navigating as other students. This is true for students with autism spectrum disorder as well. They can also use the anonymity of digital education to make themselves more comfortable in the digital social settings by the use of avatars, for example. As with my previous example, online education or blended education doesn't have to be less social. It's just social in a different way, I think. And students would have access to online support communities which we can foster, just in a different way. So I pause here again to say that the cases I present to you here are by no means as simple as the few minutes I've used to describe them. And the needs of the learners are by no means as simple as the list that I've presented to you either. And similarly, the opportunities that digital education brings are by no means as straightforward as I present to you. And I acknowledge that. There are, of course, lots of factors to consider and really important debates involved with the use of any of these opportunities and with adopting an approach that we may feel will work with students with diverse needs. But ultimately, what I do hope to illustrate, though, is that EDI and digital education do not need to be isolated priorities. They are not always complementary, as we've seen. Digital education, or the use of technology generally, can introduce new challenges for students, and it can intensify existing issues. But crucially, I would argue that they are certainly not opposing either. Considered together, they have the potential to make change and to allow for progress, and they both have this as a central tenet. It goes without saying that learners are complex, and the learning experiences of those learners are complex too, and I by no means want to oversimplify them. But what I'd like us to explore is the flexibility that digital education offers, and the flexibility to respond to this complexity with a social justice agenda in mind, as well as one that seeks to advance our digital practice. Ahead of our discussion on the 24th, I'd like you to think about how we go about that. I'd like you to think about the opportunities that digital education brings us and that new technologies bring us. I'd like you to think about, in your own context, what your priorities are in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. And I'd like you to map those to your digital education ones. I'd like you to think about what the challenges and the barriers are to this. And I'd like to think about how we overcome these, importantly. And ultimately, how we embed a coordinated approach within our practice at all levels. Thank you very much for listening. I really look forward to speaking with you all when we meet virtually on the 24th.